President-elect Trump sparked global backlash by suggesting military action to acquire Greenland and the Panama Canal, calling them vital to U.S. security. Defying decades of policy, he also proposed renaming the Gulf of Mexico, raising NATO defense spending, and criticized Biden's policies, signaling a provocative start to his presidency.
All right, so get this. We're diving into this AP News article today.
Okay.
And it is wild.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So President-elect Trump
Okay.
has made some pretty out there statements.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to unpack them all.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So you know how he believes
Yeah.
that the U.S. needs control over Greenland and the Panama Canal?
Right. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
He even suggested that he wouldn't rule out military action to get them.
Yeah. And it's a pretty big change from
Yeah.
how the U.S. has typically handled foreign policy.
Right.
So the article basically says that Trump is saying that having these areas under U.S. control is vital to American national security.
Wow.
And even more than that, he's directly quoted as saying,
Oh, really?
I'm not going to commit to that, when asked about ruling out military force.
I mean, it's definitely a bold stance.
Yeah.
Especially considering the history of both of these locations.
Exactly. I mean, Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark,
Right.
and Denmark is a longtime ally of the U.S., not to mention a NATO member.
Yeah, and there's already a huge U.S. military base there.
Exactly. It's like rewinding history.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, he also mentioned wanting to rename the Gulf of Mexico
Wow.
to the Gulf of America.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he seemed to think it sounds better. So,
Well, it's certainly creative,
yeah.
and it shows a real desire to assert American influence.
For sure.
Even in, like, symbolic ways.
Absolutely. And speaking of a certain influence,
Yeah.
the article also talks about how Trump wants Canada to become the 51st state.
Wow.
He even talks about using economic force because of trade deficits.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah. And on top of all that, we can't forget about his push for NATO members to increase their defense spending to at least 5% of their GDP.
It definitely raises some questions about his understanding of the current geopolitical landscape and his approach to international relations.
For sure. And so, like, we can't ignore the reactions that these statements have caused.
Right.
So the article mentions how Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen,
Okay.
responded to this. And she really stressed how the U.S. and Denmark are close allies,
Yeah.
and that she believes they wouldn't use force to take over Greenland.
I mean, her response is fascinating.
Yeah.
She welcomes U.S. interest in the Arctic, but she also makes it clear that Greenland's people and their autonomy need to be respected.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
And then there's this whole thing with Donald Trump Jr. visiting Greenland.
Oh, yeah. What was that about?
I don't know.
So the article mentions it was a private visit.
Yeah.
And Greenland's government even came out and said that it wasn't an official visit and that they wouldn't be formally meeting with him.
Wow. So it's almost like they were trying to distance themselves.
Yeah, it's possible. It
Yeah.
could be their way of signaling discomfort with Trump's statements
Right.
without directly challenging the U.S.
Yeah. So how did Panama react to the idea of the U.S. taking back the canal?
Well, their response, as you might expect, is that the canal's sovereignty is non-negotiable.
Right. They see it as a major victory that they fought hard for and a key part of their history and identity.
Yeah, giving up control of something as strategically important as the Panama Canal is a big ask, no matter who's asking.
For sure.
So what about Canada?
Canadian leaders were not thrilled, to say the least.
Okay.
The article highlights some pretty sharp responses,
Okay.
like Foreign Minister Melanie Joly basically saying that Trump doesn't understand Canada's strength.
Wow.
And outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he flat out rejected the whole idea.
It's like everyone's a little taken aback by these pronouncements.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what Trump is hoping to achieve with such bold statements.
It's really interesting to consider.
Yeah.
Is this about projecting strength? Is it a negotiating tactic? Is he trying to appeal to a certain segment of his base? Or is it something else entirely?
It's like a giant puzzle,
Yeah.
and we're trying to piece it all together.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most likely explanation?
Well, it's probably a combination of factors.
He's known for making bold claims, often pushing boundaries to see what he can get away with.
Yeah.
This could be part of a larger strategy, but it's definitely creating a lot of uncertainty and tension on the world stage.
This is definitely a conversation that needs to continue.
Yeah.
We've covered the main players and their reactions, but there's still so much more to unpack.
Right.
What do you say we dive even deeper in part 2?
I'm ready when you are.
Awesome.
Let's explore the historical context,
Okay.
the strategic implications, and the potential consequences of these statements.
Okay.
There's a lot more to uncover.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Welcome back. So before we jumped into the reactions to all of this, we were talking about Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Right.
And I think it's worth taking a closer look at those locations.
Yeah.
Especially considering how Trump's statements seem to disregard their unique histories.
For sure. I mean, we touched on how Greenland is an autonomous territory of Denmark.
Right.
But what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so autonomous territory basically means that Greenland has a lot of self-governing power.
Okay.
They can manage their own internal affairs,
Uh-huh.
but Denmark still handles things like foreign policy and defense.
Okay, so why would the U.S. even want control of it?
Well, Greenland is strategically important.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about it. Greenland is located in the Arctic,
Uh-huh.
a region that's becoming increasingly important as the ice melts
Right.
and new shipping routes are opening up.
Okay.
Plus, it's home to a large U.S. military base that dates back to World War II.
Oh, right. We mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, and that base has been crucial for monitoring activity in the Arctic
Okay.
during the Cold War and even today.
Uh-huh.
It gives the U.S. a significant strategic advantage in the region.
Okay.
So from a purely strategic perspective,
Yeah.
Trump's interest in Greenland isn't totally out of left field.
But suggesting he might use force to gain control of it,
Right.
that's a whole other story.
Exactly. That's what makes this so alarming.
Yeah.
It undermines the U.S.'s commitment to international norms, and it could seriously damage its relationship with Denmark,
Right.
a key NATO ally.
And what about the Panama Canal? Trump wanted to take that back. Seems even more far-fetched.
Yeah.
The U.S. hasn't been in control there for decades.
You're absolutely right. The U.S. was in control of the Panama Canal for a big chunk of the 20th century.
Right.
But in 1979, they returned the canal zone to Panama.
Uh-huh.
And then in 1999, full control of the canal itself was handed over.
So it's a pretty big deal for Panama.
Huge. It's a point of national pride for them, a symbol of their sovereignty.
Yep.
They see it as a hard-won victory after years of struggle.
Right.
So for Trump to even suggest taking it back, even just as like a hypothetical,
Right.
is bound to cause a lot of tension.
It'd be a major diplomatic blunder.
Definitely, it would signal a complete disregard for Panama's sovereignty and could really hurt U.S.-Panama relations. It also raises questions about Trump's understanding of history and international agreement.
It's mind-boggling that he would even consider such a move.
Well, we do have to consider that Trump has a history of making these really bold claims.
Right.
And sometimes he backtracks or changes his stance later on.
Yeah.
It's possible these statements are more about posturing than concrete plans.
Kind of like a negotiating tactic.
Exactly. Maybe he's trying to gain some leverage in future dealings with these countries.
Okay.
But even if it is just posturing, it creates a lot of uncertainty and instability on the world stage.
So what do we make of all this? What are the potential consequences if Trump were to actually follow through on these claims?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not just talking about some hypothetical scenarios here.
Right.
These are real actions that could have huge consequences for the entire world.
Like what?
For starters, think about international law.
Okay.
If the U.S. were to try and take control of Greenland or the Panama Canal,
Yeah.
it would be a major breach of international law.
Wow.
It would set a dangerous precedent and could erode trust between nations.
It would basically signal that the U.S. doesn't care about the rules that everyone else plays by.
Exactly. And that could embolden other countries to take similar actions, pursuing their own interests, with little regard for international norms.
Wow.
We could see a breakdown of the international order as we know it.
That sounds pretty scary.
It is a concern and prospect. The current international system, with all its flaws, is built on the idea of cooperation and peaceful resolution of disputes.
Right.
If countries start ignoring the rules and resorting to force, it could easily spiral out of control.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One aggressive action leads to another, then things really escalate.
That's a good way to put it, and the consequences wouldn't just be political.
Okay.
Think about the potential economic fallout.
Yeah.
Global trade relies heavily on stability and predictability.
Right.
If the U.S. starts seizing territories,
Yeah.
it could disrupt supply chains, cause market volatility, and trigger a global recession.
So there's a lot more at stake here than just these specific locations.
Absolutely. We're talking about the potential unraveling of the entire system of international cooperation that's been built up over decades.
Wow.
It's a very dangerous game that Trump seems to be playing.
So if these pronouncements are so potentially damaging, why is Trump making them in the first place?
Right.
What's his motivation?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say for sure what's going on in his head, but there are a few possible explanations.
Blame on me.
One possibility is that he's simply trying to project strength and dominance.
Okay.
He wants to show the world that the U.S. is back, that it's not afraid to throw its weight around and assert its interests, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
That does seem to fit with his personality and his past behavior.
Right, he's always been about projecting an image of power and success, and maybe he thinks this kind of tough talk will impress people on the world stage.
But isn't he risking alienating allies and creating more enemies than friends with this approach?
That's the big gamble. It's a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If it works, he might be able to extract some concessions from other countries and strengthen his position. But if it backfires, it could lead to a lot of instability and conflict.
It's a dangerous game of chicken, essentially.
In a sense, yes. And we're all along for the ride, whether we like it or not.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've been exploring the implications of President-elect Trump's statements about Greenland and the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
It's been pretty intense.
It's definitely been a thought-provoking journey so far. We've covered everything from historical context to potential geopolitical fallout.
Yeah.
It's clear these pronouncements have the potential to shake things up on a global scale.
Absolutely. But before we wrap things up, I think it's important to talk about how this all might affect everyday people
Yeah.
like you and me.
Right.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture of global politics
Yeah.
and forget about the human impact.
You're right behind all the political maneuvering and diplomatic wrangling. There are real people whose lives could be affected by these events.
Exactly. So let's bring it down to earth a bit. How could these pronouncements and the broader trends they represent impact people's lives in like a tangible way?
Well, the most immediate and devastating impact would be felt if these tensions escalate into actual conflicts.
Right.
Imagine the situation in Greenland or Panama if things were to turn violent.
Yeah.
We could see displacement, loss of life, economic hardship, and major social upheaval.
It's a sobering thought. It's easy to forget that behind all the political rhetoric and strategic calculations, there are real people with families, jobs, and dreams who could be caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. And even if we manage to avoid outright conflict, the increased tension and mistrust created by these pronouncements could still have a ripple effect on all of us.
Right.
Imagine increased security measures at airports, more stringent visa restrictions, a general sense of unease when interacting with people from certain countries.
It's like the world becomes a more divided and suspicious place. You start seeing barriers going up between people and cultures.
Exactly. We've already seen similar trends in recent years with the rise of nationalism, xenophobia, and a retreat from globalization in many parts of the world. Right. These pronouncements could fuel that trend, making it harder for people to connect and cooperate across borders.
It's a concerning thought, and the impact wouldn't be limited to international relations. This kind of rhetoric can also spill over into domestic politics and social dynamics within countries.
That's a crucial point. The us versus them mentality that often gets amplified in these situations can be incredibly divisive.
Yeah.
It can create an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, lead into discrimination, intolerance, and even violence against minority groups within societies.
It's a reminder that the way we talk about the world and our place in it really matters. Words have power, and they can shape perceptions, beliefs, and ultimately actions.
Absolutely. It's more important than ever to engage in these discussions with a sense of responsibility and a commitment to truth, empathy, and understanding.
It's about fostering a culture of dialogue and respect, even when we disagree, and recognizing our shared humanity, regardless of our nationality, ethnicity, or ideology.
Well said. We need to remember that we're all interconnected and our fates are intertwined. What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the specifics of Trump's pronouncements to the broader implications for global politics and even the potential impact on our everyday lives.
It's been a fascinating exploration of the complexities and challenges of our interconnected world.
And as always, we want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Yeah.
Something to chew on after the episode is over.
I like that. What's your final thought for our listeners today?
Well, we spent a lot of time focusing on the potential risks and downsides of these developments. But what if we flip the script for a moment?
Intrigue and go on.
What if instead of seeing these pronouncements solely as threats,
Right.
we also saw them as opportunities?
Opportunities. I'm not sure I follow.
What I mean is, maybe these statements, controversial as they are, could spark a broader conversation about the future of the global order.
I see what you're saying. You're suggesting that by challenging the status quo, these pronouncements could force us to re-examine our assumptions and consider different paths forward.
Exactly. What if they prompt us to ask tough questions about the role of the U.S. in the world, the effectiveness of international institutions, the principles that should guide our foreign policy?
That's a really thought-provoking idea. It's like using these pronouncements, disruptive as they are, as a catalyst for a much-needed debate about the future of global governance.
Precisely. Instead of simply reacting to Trump's statements, we could use them as a springboard for a more proactive and visionary approach to shaping the world we want to live in.
It's about turning a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth and transformation.
Exactly. It's about reframing the narrative and focusing on the possibilities rather than getting bogged down by the threats.
I like that it's a more optimistic and hopeful way to approach this situation. It reminds us that even in the face of uncertainty and challenge, we still have agency. We can choose how we respond, and we can work together to shape a better future.
Well said. And that's a perfect note to end on. So, to our listeners out there, we leave you with this question. Are these pronouncements a harbinger of doom, or could they be a catalyst for positive change? It's up to all of us to decide. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Trump's bold and unconventional statements have already sent shockwaves through the international community, raising questions about the direction of U.S. foreign policy under his leadership. As allies and rivals alike brace for his presidency, the world watches closely to see if these controversial proposals will translate into action or remain political theater. The coming months promise to test global diplomacy and the resilience of long-standing alliances.